Hello, everybody. Ej here, and for anybody new here, I make casual reviews, and they are just my opinion, so take everything I say with a massive grain of salt. But today, I'm going to be doing the next installment in my Great Album series. This is also the first one with the new name. It's no longer the Great Classic Album series, because I feel like that opens the door to much more discussion, because I understand how it can be confusing. Not every single album here is a universally deemed classic, and I just don't want there to be too much confusion. So I figured, why not just make it simpler and just call it the Great Album Series? Because even if they are not all necessarily classics, I think all of these albums are great. For anybody new here, in this series, I cover just 10 albums in chronological order from when they were released, and just talk about them. The first album I'm going to be talking about in today's video is from 1978. It is The Police's debut album, Outlandos d'Amour. I actually have already discussed Ghost in the Machine on this channel. The Police is one of those bands where I feel like out of all the bands that came out of the post-punk sort of movement in the late 70s and early 80s, The Police definitely took it in their own unique direction. But on their debut album, Outlandos d'Amour, you really see them still a bit more raw, still a bit more punky than they usually are. This is without a doubt their most, raw album, really, definitely, I think. But despite that more raw, punky tone to it, there is also a fair amount of reggae influence on some of these tracks, on tracks like Roxanne. And I think that this album, just in general, has some of the Police's best material, such as So Lonely, one of their most catchy, just infectious, more pop tracks. I love that track a lot. And then Can't Stand Losing You, one of their best earlier, more punky songs, like I said. Overall, Outlandos d'Amour really did set the groundwork for what the Police would do on their future albums, and I just think it was a really strong debut. The next album I'm going to be talking about is from 1989, and it is Operation Ivy's Energy. To me, this is just an extremely important and solid ska punk album, and just East Bay punk album, an overall great band. Arguably one of the best to come out of the East Bay, and later on they would sort of morph into Rancid, another band that I've talked about on this channel. But Operation Ivy's influence cannot be ignored. While they might not be the most well-known punk band, or even the most widely acclaimed punk band, their influence on bands like Green Day and obviously bands like Rancid and just the East Bay punk scene in general cannot go understated. They are one of the most influential bands from their time. Some of the most quintessential songs also appear on this album in the development of ska punk, and even skate punk, and even later on pop punk. Songs like Knowledge, Unity, Take Warning, I think are some of the best ska punk songs out there. And I just also think it is an important band because they were very crucial to the survival of Lookout Records in their early days, arguably one of the most successful bands on Lookout Records, and really did, play a key role in the East Bay punk sound, one of my favorite punk movements that, like I said before, gave birth to bands like Green Day, which is a band that I love quite a bit. And, Lookout Records is one of the best labels, and I really think Lookout Records would not have been as successful in the underground if it wasn't for Operation Ivy and the success of Energy from 1989. The next album I'm going to be talking about is from 1991, and it is another punk album. There's a lot of kind of punk themes going on this week for some reason. It is Pegboy's Strong Reaction. Pegboy is a relatively underground punk band from the Chicago area, and this is their debut album from 1991. It is honestly one of my favorite punk albums to come out of the Chicago punk scene in the 90s, and I guess I have a bit of a bias here because I do live in the general Chicago greater area, so I do have a predisposition to kind of like this band, but, I think that their melodic blend of genres like grunge, pop punk, skate punk, hardcore, and even a bit of emo really makes me come back to Strong Reaction quite a bit. And I really do think that Pegboy does have one of the most unique sounding sounds of really many of these punk bands in the 90s. I really am kind of disappointed that more people don't appreciate them or even are aware of them. A lot of times they go unnoticed, and it's really disappointing because I genuinely do think that Pegboy is one of the strongest bands to come out of the Chicago scene in the 90s, and I do think Strong Reaction is honestly just one of my favorite debut punk albums out there in the entire 90s. I think it's a really good blend of of types of styles of punk, and I think it just came together well, and I really think everybody should check out Pegboy's Strong Reaction. Changing it up a little bit, the next album I'm going to be talking about is from a hip-hop group, A Tribe Called Quest. The Low End Theory, also from 1991. The jazz rap and more conscious sound of Tribe's second studio album is, in my opinion, their greatest work. I think this is just a great milestone in not only just jazz rap, but also alternative kind of rap altogether, and alternative hip-hop. You know, it really helped launch Busta Rhymes' solo career as well, that goes without saying. But overall, the album as a whole is just a great blend of different styles in hip-hop and jazz and different sort of alternative styles, and it really blends together to make one of the most interesting hip-hop albums of the 90s. I honestly do admit, and while I am very cautious to admit, I do think that a lot of 90s and 80s hip-hop is hit or miss, in my personal opinion, for my personal taste. There's a lot of greats out there, a lot of great artists out there, but there's a lot of duds out there as well that I think have not aged that well. However, A Tribe Called Quest, and especially The Low End Theory, has aged tremendously well, and I think still holds up today, and I think the influence could also still be heard to this day. The next album I'm going to be talking about is from 1992, and it's Pavement's Slanted and Enchanted. The lo-fi, slacker, and indie sound of this album is without a doubt one of the quintessential albums in indie rock in the entire 90s. There's just something so sporadic and in the moment about this album that really gives it a very classic, very great sound in my opinion. It sounds like an album that can't even be recreated by Pavement, because like I said, it really does sound like an album that was made in the moment, for the moment, and without any sort of, concern about how it was going to be, looked upon. And it's reminiscent of the sound that groups like Weezer would adopt later on, but in a much more raw way, a much more just lo-fi slackery way, I guess you could say. Overall, Pavement sound is really I think Pavement on Slanted and Enchanted really made a quintessential album, and I think this is their best album in my opinion. I think it's the peak of their sound, even though it's their debut album. Really great, solid album I come back to time and time again. The next album I'm going to be talking about is from 1993, and it is Nirvana's In Utero. I think this is their best album. Nevermind might get a lot of the talk, a lot of the hype, and while I love Nevermind, it is a great album. It's a really well-polished album. In Utero's more gritty production and less accessible track list really makes it stand out to me. There are many tracks on here where it is definitely much more experimental, much more, much more sporadic than their previous works, just less of a focus on commercial aspects of this album, less of a focus on polishing the sound, and just much more raw energy that I really think is a glimpse into Kurt Cobain's hectic mind towards this point in their career. Unfortunately, this is their last album because unfortunately Kurt Cobain's demise would bring down the band. But I really do think that In Utero has some of the band's best material. The opening track, Serve the Servants, has always been a personal favorite of mine. And I really do just think that it is one of their best albums, if not their best album. And I come back to this album more than any of their other albums. It's more raw, gritty production, and the bit more loud, noisy, and just inaccessible parts of this album really make it stand out to me. And that's why In Utero is my favorite Nirvana album. Now, this next album I'm going to be talking about is one I've actually been wanting to talk about for a while. It is from 1994, and it is Weezer's Blue. Yes, Weezer made my great album series. I have been super critical of Weezer overall. I really do genuinely think that ever since Blue, and especially since after Pinkerton, they just have not made that good of music. Almost everything I think they've put out in the 21st century has simply not been that good. Now, you could challenge me on that, whatever, you're not going to change my mind, but to me, nothing Weezer has done comes close to Blue. Blue is without a doubt one of the best alternative albums of the 90s, and it is honestly just a personal favorite of mine. It's back when Weezer's quirkiness wasn't cringy and was honestly refreshing in the music scene, when everything seemed to be a bit too dark, a bit too serious. You had Weezer come along and really just liven things up with their sort of quirky, little bit nerdy look, their nerdy sound, their sort of alternative and also a bit punky sound to them as well. Overall, it was just refreshing, and I just think the album is phenomenal. It's a near perfect track list, and unfortunately, Weezer has not been able to make an album of this magnitude since, and that is very disappointing, but unfortunately, I personally believe that it is true. But I really did want to talk about Weezer Blue a little bit, just so people know I'm not just a blind Weezer hater. I do at least enjoy something Weezer has done. Now, this next album is from 1995, and I am actually surprised that I have not talked about it before. Radiohead, The Bends. One of my favorite albums, a top 3 album of all time, in my opinion. I already talked about Kid A on here, and I actually have a Radiohead tier list coming out soon, so you could look forward to that. But to me, this is a top 3 album of all time, and the reason I love this album so much, the reason I would say this album is a 10 out of 10, despite it not being as ambitious as, say, OK Computer and Kid A, is because every little bit of this album, in my opinion, is just well crafted and some of the best music I've ever heard. It just, not only do I have a personal connection to this album, but they took everything good about Pablo Honey, but magnified it to a level unreachable. It's one of the, I think it is arguably up there with some of the best albums of all time, and, I know I sound like a broken record, but flawless track list, some of their best material, tracks like Street Spirit, Black Star, Fake Plastic Trees, The Bends, Planet Telex, just My Iron Lung, some of their best songs, some of the best songs ever recorded, some of the best guitar work ever recorded, some of the best lyrics ever written. Overall, I have nothing negative to say about The Bends. It really is one of the best albums I've ever heard in my life. I come back to it more than any other Radiohead album, and I just love it. It's about time I gave it a spot on one of these videos. Now, this next album I'm talking about might seem a bit weird because, to be fair, I'm quite critical of the genre. Jimmy Eat World, Bleed American from 2001. I am very skeptical and critical of much emo pop-punk that came out in the early 2000s and even throughout the 2000s. And honestly, I still do not enjoy bands like Fall Out Boy, Panic at the Disco, or even Blink-182. I find little enjoyment in their sound. However, Jimmy Eat World is one of those few bands that to me really did stand out amongst the rest, especially their contemporaries. Well, and especially on Bleed American. Bleed American, to me, is an extremely well-focused, well-written, very tight pop-punk album that does everything a pop-punk album is supposed to do, and actually, it's a really well-written album, and I think is, one of the best albums to come out of this era, and definitely is a step above what many of their contemporaries were doing. Vocally, I really like the fact that the singer doesn't sound just like your stereotypical emo singer, which is very refreshing. And overall, it has some of the best pop-punk songs of the 2000s, like The Middle and the self-titled track, or the title track, Bleed American. Some of the best material. I think it's Jimmy Eat World's best album. Out of all these albums from this era, I probably come back to Bleed American the most. I might talk about My Chemical Romance later on. They're one of the few bands that from this era that I do enjoy quite a bit as well. But yeah, Jimmy Eat World, I think, definitely stood above the crowd when you had an endless sea of bad bands like Fall Out Boy and Panic at the Disco that were just plaguing the earth. Now, the final album I'm going to be talking about is from 2002, and it is Bright Eyes, Lifted. Now, I could say the whole title, but I don't feel like it. Even though Digital Ash, and this is from 2002, even though Digital Ash and A Digital Urn and The People's Key are some of my favorite Bright Eyes albums, there's just something so much more raw and unfiltered in nature of Lifted. The dramatic, very passionate and emotional sound on this album makes it one of their most heart-wrenching and emo-sounding albums, definitely. To me, I think it's Connor at his most emo. And some of his best songwriting, some of his most touching songwriting, I actually have Digital Ash up there, I just realized. But in general, I think Bright Eyes on a Lift, it definitely showed a side of them that was even more emotional than more vulnerable as well than they even ever let shown before. And they're a very emotional band. And with that being said, those are the 10 albums from The Police, Operation Ivy, Pegboy, A Tribe Called Quest, Pavement, Nirvana, Weezer, Radiohead, Jimmy Eat World, and Bright Eyes that I consider to be great albums. I love these albums. I think they are great. I think they are all 8 out of 10 or more, and I think everybody should check them out. Also, I just wanted to, before I end this video, I recently got this album. In both of these, actually, I talked about in this series. Turn on the Bright Lights by Interpol, excellent album. I've talked about them before. And Generator by Bad Religion, one of my favorite punk albums in the 90s. And with that being said, thank you all, and good night. Get a good night's sleep. It's actually really healthy for you.